So let us now return to the case of pressure gradient dominated flow of pi much less than 1 and ask what is the error that one would incur if we use this analysis to neglect the electro-osmotic term, and to see if that the error in the analysis is commensurate with our estimation based on the condition involving pi being much less than 1. So remember now our governing equations for the scaling where we had assumed that the pressure gradient dominates. Is d square u by dy square is equal to minus 1, and u is equal to pi Is that right? Yes, u equal to pi at y is 0. Alright. So now what we'll do is let's solve this problem exactly, so that by comparing the exact solution to the approximate solution where we drop pi, we can find the error in our calculation. So this is relatively straightforward, of course. If we carry out one integration, we will get du by dy is equal to minus a constant, let me call it a, sorry, I get minus y, yes, after doing one integration, and I also have a, yes, this is where the constant will come, a constant sitting here, and then a second integration on top of this. After doing the second integration, I get u is equal to minus y square by 2 plus ay plus b. So now let's apply the boundary conditions. So I know that u is equal to pi at y equal to 0, so that's 0 plus b, so clearly b is pi, and so this is at y equal to 0, and then if I look at y equal to 1, I get again pi is equal to minus half plus a plus pi. Yes, because b was already pi, so I cancel pi and a is equal to half. And therefore, my solution for the velocity is minus y square by 2 plus y by 2 plus pi. Okay, so this is my exact solution. And now, typically what we would like to know is maybe the average velocity through the channel, or the flow rate through the channel, which is just the average velocity times the height of the channel. So let's calculate the mean velocity. So that means, or rather the mean velocity or the flow rate, which is basically the integral of u dy going from 0 to 1 upon 1, because I've already scaled everything out. So that channel goes from 0 to 1. Yes. So now on integrating this, I get y cube upon 2 3 is 6 plus y square by 4 plus pi times y. Yes, and the limits are 0 to 1. So if I apply those limits now, I get, so of course, when y is 0, all the y's cancel out. That's pi, which is nothing but 1 by 12 plus pi. So this is the mean velocity u bar. Okay, so we can ask, so the error in u bar if pi is neglected. So what is the error? Basically, if I set pi to 0, I get u bar is 1 by 12. And the error I'm calculated is simply just pi, as you know from the exact solution. And so the error is equal to nothing but pi over the answer without pi. So it's 12 pi. So what does this mean? This means that, let's say, if pi is equal to 0.1, then the error is 1.2. Yes, or 10%. Oh, sorry, that doesn't make any sense. So I understood. Yeah. So the way I define the error, this is already the relative error. It is the error pi over the value without if pi was 0. So that means this is 1.2. So in terms of percent, it's actually 120%. So you can see the error is larger than the. I mean, it's quite large. It's at the order of the prediction itself. So this is a bad assumption. So if pi is 0.1, I mean, it's not enough to drop it. The error is order 1. But if pi is 0.01, of course, then the error becomes 0.12, or now just 12%. And if you really drop to 0.001, then the error will become 0.012, or now 1.2%, and this is something that I think we can live with. So you see now that the analysis checks out in the sense that as pi becomes smaller, the error in completely setting pi to 0 also decreases. Moreover, we can estimate the error roughly by the value of pi itself, because remember, pi now is not just Vs. If you know the value of Vs, the slip velocity, the pressure gradient, the height, and so on, by putting them into the pi which gives us our condition, we can get some idea of how good our estimate will be. Why? So remember, our condition for dropping pi, for setting pi to 0, was that pi is much less than 1. And let's say what we have found now is that if Vs is Vs and delta p are such that pi is 0.1, then the error can be order 1, and so on. So we see that the error roughly is within a factor of 10 of the value of pi. So the estimate that pi gives us for accuracy is correct within a value of 10, which is roughly correct within an order of magnitude. So this is the power of scaling analysis. Even though it doesn't give you an exact result, you do know that if pi is 0.001, your error at most will be 0.01, which is what we see here in terms of relative error, or around 1%. So that's why even without solving the problem, in this case we actually solve the problem, and these numbers are from the exact solution. But this estimate is from just scaling without solving. And the scaling prediction, or the scaling estimate, we find is accurate to within one order of magnitude, or a factor of 10. Factor of 10 roughly. So this is yet another fruitful result of scaling. So remember, scaling already showed us its value by giving us fewer non-parameters. Then it forced us to make statements about the physics and led us to an equation that we could then simplify in a consistent manner. That came from order 1 scaling. And finally, the order 1 scaling gives us a condition for when these terms can be neglected, and that condition is reasonably good to within an order of magnitude. Now finally, before concluding, there is yet another subtle, interesting point which this humble but rich example serves to illustrate. So to see that, let's go back to our expression for the exact velocity. So this is the exact solution. So you see that the error in the exact solution, again, if we were to drop pi, is just pi. And we saw what the consequence or what the error would be in the mean velocity. And that we saw is reasonably predicted by the value of pi itself. However, suppose you were interested in the actual velocity profile within the channel, then what would the error be? So you can see that these two terms taken together, their value is maximum, is actually minimum as you approach the walls. So this term goes to 0 when y is 0, or even when y is 1, because you have 1 minus 1. If y is equal to half, so let's do this. Yes. So at y equal to 0 or 1, we know that u is basically pi. Yes. And if y is equal to half, then we have minus 1 by 2 4s are 8, yes, plus so basically u is sorry, u is 1 by 8 plus pi. Okay, so you see now that if pi is very small, let's say even 0.01, then this term is typically is around 0.1, so 0.1. So the relative error will be small if pi is very small here, because the value near the center is 0.1, and so the relative error is about 10 pi. So again you get the same result. Yes, so here the relative error is approximately 10 pi. So it's within a factor of order magnitude of pi. However, in this case, at the wall, the relative error is pi over, let's say 0 is basically going to infinity if I use the same logic, where the error is defined as the term that would vanish if pi is 0 divided by the term that survives when pi is 0. But near the wall, the velocity is 0 if there is no electroosmotic flow. So even though pi is small, the value changes in a relative sense, I mean, infinite, although that doesn't make, it's not very meaningful. But what this means is that near the wall, pi is not negligible. Near the wall, pi cannot be neglected. So the electroosmotic effects which live near the wall, they could be neglected if one was interested in calculating the mean flow rate or the flow rate near, or the velocity near the center of the pi. But if you go near the wall, then clearly electroosmotic flow has to become important, because in its absence the velocity is completely zero. So any non-zero value in a relative term is in a relative sense would be important there. So how can we analyze this more precisely? Or in other words, how can we say how far we need to be away from the wall before we can neglect the influence of pi for small pi? Well, you see, this is now starting to approach the idea of a boundary layer. In other words, pi is negligible in the bulk of the domain, except for some layer near the walls or some boundary near the walls where its influence starts to become greater than that of the pressure gradient. So how do we find this? Well, it turns out that again scaling allows us a simple way of doing this. So scaling allows us to estimate the boundary layer. Where pi becomes important. Even if pi is less than 1. In other words, the electroosmotic effects become important. So how do we see this? Well, let's go back to our equations now. The key step here is, let's go back to the original equations. Yes, right here. So you see, yeah, this was the full equation just after inserting the scales. Now, a key point here is that we had chosen the velocity scale from the boundary condition the length scale from the boundary condition to be h. So when we chose the length scale or the scale for the y coordinate to be h, we implicitly said that we are interested in phenomena that occurs across the entire channel. Yes, but now our question has to do with the phenomena in a region close to a wall. So in this case, the choice of length scale h is not appropriate. Indeed, now we should, the length scale should be the size of the boundary layer, and it should be determined by the fact that in that boundary layer, the Vs or the electroosmotic velocity is important, but also the pressure gradient continues to play a role because that is what is driving the flow. So in other words, rather than fixing the length scale and choosing, only having UC free, by letting the length scale to be free, something that we have to choose from the problem, we can then keep the electroosmotic effects in, and then by requiring the pressure gradient to play a role, determine the length scale from here, determine YC. So in other words, we do not fix YC based on H. We say that we aren't in a position to apply the boundary condition far from the wall. We only want to go near one wall. Let's say near y equal to 0. So near y equal to 0, we have u is equal to Vs upon Uc. And we say, oh look, Uc must be determined by Vs because we are so close to the wall. Yes? And if we are close to the wall, Uc becomes Vs. But now Yc should be chosen such that the pressure gradient term is able to balance the viscous term in the equation, because after all, in the bulk of the channel, the balance is between viscous forces and pressure gradients. Right? In our given problem, we can't have the pressure gradient dominating in the channel and then near the wall this equation changing character. So in order to match the solution in the domain for that to be consistent in that in the wall, we still have to balance these terms. But we can balance this and choose UC to be Vs because now the length scale will be set by the balance of forces. So let's work that out. So let's now keep, let's call Yc to be the boundary layer. So we choose Y characteristic to be delta, the boundary layer thickness, and then near the y equal to 0 boundary. Remember, we are looking for the boundary where Vs is important, so clearly u equal to Vs by Uc, and we make this set to 1, so we get u equal to 1, right, and Uc equal to Vs. So we choose this because now we are trying to find the boundary layer where electroosmotic flow is important, so therefore clearly Uc must be Vs now. So u is equal to 1 at the y equal to 0 boundary. We don't look at the boundary at y equal to 1 because that is now far away. We are only interested in the physics near the y equal to 0 wall. Of course, we could have done it for the other wall, it would have been the same. And now the governing equation is equal to minus delta P over L. Now delta square, which is y characteristic, divided by mu, divided by Uc, which is just Vs. Right? Yes, delta P over L, this will be delta square by mu, and Uc is Vs. And then, so delta is determined by the balance between this between the pressure gradient and the viscous forces. In other words, if you want to think of it as a diffusion of momentum analog, the wall, the slip at the wall, electroosmotic slip at the wall, supplies velocity. That velocity diffuses into the domain, but the distance to which its diffusion is effective is counteracted by the pressure gradient driven flow. So if this pressure gradient driven flow was zero, if this term wasn't there, then given enough time, the momentum from the wall would diffuse throughout the domain, and ultimately the solution everywhere would have the velocity equal to Vf. This is what we saw when the pressure gradient is negligible. But if the pressure gradient is strong, then the diffusion of momentum from the wall only extends a limited distance, which is the thickness of the boundary layer. And that is set by the competition between the diffusion of viscous forces and the pressure gradient source term, which is driving its own flow. And so that just means that we set this quantity to 1. So we obtain delta is equal to length of the channel, viscosity Vs divided by the applied pressure gradient, the whole square root. So this is my boundary layer thickness. And so that this equation then becomes equal to 1. That's how we chose it. -1, sorry. Alright, so you see, this is how we've now obtained the boundary layer thickness, where electroosmotic forces are important, and clearly that thickness, now you see, the scaling also tells us how that thickness varies with our pyrometers. So in accordance with our understanding, if you increase the electric field and increase the strength of the slip flow, this boundary layer where the slip is important will keep increasing. Conversely, if you reduce the pressure, if you increase the pressure gradient, that thickness will decrease, and you can see the role that viscosity plays here. In fact, the viscosity will drop out because remember, Vs scales as 1 over viscosity. So Us times Vs will just give us the electric field. So it's really a competition between, or in other words, it's the square root of L times the electric field, or it varies as L times the electric field upon delta P. Yes, and then here you have the permittivity and the zeta potential. So just from this, one can get an idea of how close to the wall, the distance away from the wall where this electric field will play a role. Now, why is this important? So even though the mean velocity may not change much, or the average flow rate or the velocity at the center of the channel may not be affected by the electric field, what this is telling me is that in this boundary layer near the wall, the electric field will play a role and the velocity will increase. How much will it increase? It will increase by exactly pi. That's what we saw here. The velocity is just pi at the wall. So this is useful because imagine I have a channel now. Yes, the old flow was exactly 0 at the walls. This was pi equal to 0. But if pi is greater than 0 but still less than 1, our profile would now be slightly different. It would be almost the same everywhere. So it looks parabolic, this part matches that, but instead of going to 0, it stops somewhere finite. So it changes its shape a little bit so that you have some finite thing at the wall, and this finite gap is of magnitude pi. Now the reason this is important is, imagine now I have some particles in this flow. Yes, so in the normal flow, particles near the wall will basically get stuck at the wall. They won't move because you have the no slip condition. So if they're tiny particles can keep getting stuck at the wall, dust particles and so on. And so over a long time of using the channel, it can maybe occlude the walls, and this might disturb the operation of the channel, or it might lead to accumulation accumulation of particles and spoil the operation of the device. On the other hand, by putting a slight electric field, I can induce a velocity that matters not in the bulk, where anyway I don't care, the particles will get swept out, but I induce a velocity exactly at the wall, which is where I want the particles to move. And I can adjust the region near the wall where particles will flow by controlling the relative electric field. And the strength of the flow can also be controlled by the electric field relative to the pressure gradient, and so I can have these particles swept along. Even though they may be swept slowly, they will still move out of the channel. So you can see that in this case, there is some value to having a weak electroosmotic flow, and it has some application. And a simple scaling analysis can tell us all these answers without even solving the problem. We only solve the problem here just so that we can prove to ourselves that the estimates given by the dimensionless parameter pi for the error are reasonable within an order of magnitude. But even if it was a complex problem, imagine if I didn't have this simple domain, if I didn't have a simple planar channel, but I had some complex three-dimensional channel. The governing equations would be slightly different, but the scalings would be the same. I would have get the same scale factor ultimately, maybe with some other geometric ratios involved. But the fundamental group of the problem, which is like the Reynolds number in flow through a pipe, here the fundamental group is this group, unnamed group pi. And it is this pi which would be the same determining group regardless of whether the channel was shaped like an oval or some other funny shape, or it was a rectangle or whatever may be the case. The numerical factors coming in front of the errors and so on would be different. But the governing balance of forces is the same. So the determining or defining group of the problem remains pi. And so I can still make the same decisions about whether I should neglect electroosmotic flow or what is the thickness of the boundary layer where the electroosmotic flip is important and so on, using the exact same analysis without ever solving that complex three-dimensional problem, which otherwise I would have to solve maybe in Fluent or in COMSOL and solve multiple times to determine how to design my system. But now I get all that information just from scaling. Scaling also has another side benefit. Even if one was to solve the problem numerically in CFD, for example, or computational fluid dynamics. The reason is now, if you look at the governing equations that we scaled, without simplifying anything, where were they? Yes, here. Here. So the governing equations were d square u square is equal to -1, u equal to pi at y equal to 0, 1. So you see that this scaled form of the equation using order 1 scaling, it has ensured that all the terms appearing in the equation are maximum, they have a value 1. And pi, we said, remember, we scaled it in such a way that pi is small, so pi also will not be large. So for a numerical simulation, this is great, because this ensures that we have brought the equations into a form where all the terms we're going to code are going to have values around maximum of order 1. We're not going to have any extremely large numbers coming up in the simulation. And this is good from the perspective of simple numerical accuracy. Because if you have a problem where you have small numbers and very large numbers and then divide by those large numbers, you can lose and round off and have all kinds of round off errors. Whereas now those things are eliminated simply by scaling terms in the equation with appropriate scale factors which capture its magnitude. So instead of having some terms which are like 1,000 or 1 million, for example, if you want to solve flow in the atmosphere where the velocities are large and the scales go into kilometers, you could have all kinds of big numbers come in, unless you decide that you scale the problem with the appropriate length and time scale suitable to that problem. And this is really the beauty of scaling. The idea behind scaling is to represent the magnitude of terms like velocities and lengths, not in terms of some arbitrary defined system like the SI system, but in terms of scales or units that are natural to the problem itself. Now, certainly the SI system by which all engineers live by is very important for design and building and for communication of plans between people and so on, because it's a standard framework on which we can specify dimensions of things. But when it comes to the analysis of a problem, that is when you want to live within the world of a problem, a unit like 1 meter has no meaning. So if I say my channel is 1 meter, that in itself doesn't tell me if it's big or small relative to my problem. So in our case, the bigness of a channel has to do with whether electroosmotic effects can be neglected. And you see here the natural units to compare that was in terms of this term pi, this non-dimensional parameter. So when it comes to, for example, the velocity scale, instead of using meter per second, which means nothing to my problem, I instead write the velocity scale in terms of delta p h square by L mu. And so when I put in the parameters of the problem, it can tell me whether the velocity is large or small relative to a scale that has meaning. And it's because of this choice, you can say choice of appropriate natural units, that is scaling velocities by a velocity factor coming out of the problem's physical parameters itself, that I can say whether certain terms of the equation are large or small. Now this, before I end, I would like to highlight a very nice article of Aris where he makes this wonderful point that this practice of scaling, that is of representing terms and their magnitude in terms of the problem itself, or in terms of something natural within the problem, has a close similarity to what poets do when they use poetic imagery to convey an idea that they want to communicate. So Aris gives a nice example in his article Manners Make It Modelers, which I think it will be nice for us to spend a couple of minutes on. Yes, so poetic imagery and scaling. So this, in his article in Chemical Engineering Science in 1991, this was actually the transcript of his Danckwerts Memorial Lecture, was on the practice of modeling. And towards the end, Aris discusses this similarity by giving this example from John Keats, from a poem by John Keats called The Eve of Saint Agnes. So it goes as such: Saint Agnes's Eve, ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling over the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. Now you see what the poet is doing here is he wants to convey the idea that on Saint Agnes Eve, it was really quite cold. Now, instead of saying that, instead of using some units to convey the cold, he has conveyed the feeling of coldness to the reader or to the listener in terms of the natural scenery of his setup. So, as you read this poem, you can imagine how cold it was by picturing the owl huddled over with its feathers, trying to minimize its loss of heat. You can see the hare trembling because of the cold. The hare is basically like a rabbit, walking on the grass whose blades are frozen because of frost. And you can imagine all the sheep in this flock huddled together to try and keep warm. So that kind of imagery is universal, regardless of whether someone follows degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. Everyone will understand the sense of coldness of this winter day that John Keats is trying to communicate. In contrast, you can compare this with a different version, which Aris suggested as an example, where you say, Saint Agnes Eve, how bitter chill it was. The temperature was barely -2. And now you see in comparison how flat the second example is. And moreover, apart from losing the beauty of the poem, this also may not mean the same thing for someone who doesn't use degrees Celsius, but rather uses Fahrenheit. Or if someone who has actually never experienced a -2 degrees Celsius day won't know how cold that means. Or if, for example, if you've always lived in Chennai, for example, where the temperature never goes below 20 and 18 would be considered a frigid winter, you would have no concept of what -2 is. Whereas by reading Keats' poem, you can get some sense of that cold night because he has used imagery from the scene itself. So this is the same sort of idea that we adopt in scaling. We don't use some arbitrary units, let's say a length scale based on a bar of metal preserved in Paris. Rather, we use a length scale that comes out from the problem itself, be it the thickness of a length scale coming from a boundary layer analysis, or the length of the pipe in which we are considering the flow, and so on for the velocities and temperatures and all the other variables in the problem. So I hope this lecture has conveyed some of the importance and power of scaling, and also the joy that follows applying a scaling analysis and learning about the problem as we go along. You'd have also seen that it is, in some sense, a give and take and a trial exercise. So you begin the problem with some expectation and some understanding. A few things are clear. For example, in this problem, it was clear that viscous forces are definitely going to play a role. but then as you go along, you can investigate different limits where different terms are important. And if you run into trouble, the scaling shows this trouble to you, and you can come back and revisit your original assumptions. And this is the sort of process by which we understand more about the problem and why scaling is valuable. So with this, we come to the end of this lecture on scaling. And we will look now over the next few lectures on other concrete problems, but each of them focused on revealing a particular technique which is useful in the analysis of transport phenomena. So with that, I thank you, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next lecture.